She danced for the world, but never for her own heart. He ruled empires, yet could never tame what he felt. When Elena Moreau and Michael Blackwood cross paths again in London, the past stirs like an old melody. And between stages and legacies, two lives learn that some loves never truly fade. They simply wait for the right moment to breathe again. This is the story of two heirs marked by pride, and by a desire they could never bury. On stage, beneath the golden lights of the Royal Opera House, Elena Moreau seemed to float between the sound of the piano and the silence hiding between the notes. Every gesture was a secret, every movement a confession no one could hear. To the audience, she was perfection. To herself, a soul in constant war between the disciplined body and the untamable heart. London was cold that night, and the fogged glass of the Grand Hall reflected a woman in motion, elegant and steady, but with a gaze that betrayed exhaustion. The imaginary applause echoing in her mind was no longer enough. Elena danced, but did not feel alive. She danced to maintain control, the same kind of control she had learned to use to escape the past, to silence memories that insisted on breathing beneath her skin. The clock struck almost midnight when rehearsal ended. She turned off the theater lights, surrounded by the scent of waxed floors and the faint perfume of flowers left in the dressing room. The sound of her lonely footsteps echoed through the historic walls, reminding her that no success could ever fill the emptiness of the soul. The city outside pulsed, indifferent, and as the lights of Covent Garden shimmered in the distance, she wondered when applause had lost its meaning. Back at her apartment in Kensington, the London cold greeted her with the same silence as always. Her tired body begged for rest, but her mind kept spinning, as if she were still on stage. Her mother's voice still echoed from the phone call that morning. "Come home, Elena. Your father needs to talk to you." Andrew Moreau's deep tone did not allow for refusal, and she knew what would come. The same subject as always, the family businesses, the endless meetings, the decisions she had never wanted to make. She lay down on the bed without changing out of her leotard, staring at the ceiling as one stares into a mirror. The ceiling of the apartment looked just like the one from her childhood, white, distant, expressionless. "I wasn't born for this," she thought. "I wasn't born for spreadsheets and shareholders." She had been born for movement, for the sound of the orchestra that invades the body and transforms it. But even the most perfect music could not silence the name that came to mind every time the world grew quiet. Michael Blackwood. His name was a wound that time could not heal. Since childhood, Michael had always been there, the godparent's son, the arrogant boy, the gaze that challenged her in everything. They had grown up side by side, surrounded by privilege and expectations. And even when they fought, even when they despised each other, there was something in his eyes that made her uneasy. A kind of attraction never spoken aloud, but felt in every gesture. Years had passed, and fate, cruel and ironic, seemed about to bring them together again. The next morning, London awoke under a pale mist. Elena crossed the streets of South Kensington wrapped in a grey overcoat, her hair tied in a rushed bun, her hands hidden in leather gloves. The family's black car waited discreetly in front of the building. The driver opened the door, and silently, she got in. As the car moved through the elegant avenues, her reflection in the glass seemed distant, the ballerina and the daughter of businessmen coexisting in one body, two versions that never understood each other. The Moreau mansion stood on a quiet hill in Hampstead, surrounded by geometric gardens and marble sculptures that reflected Andrew's refined and controlled taste. When Elena stepped out of the car, the cold air cut her face like a warning. Her mother greeted her at the door, with the same sweet smile as always, and the anxious look of someone who knows her daughter's temper. "He's waiting for you in the office," was all she said, in a low tone. Andrew Moreau's office smelled of leather and old wood. Her father stood behind his desk, dressed in a dark suit, his eyes fixed on reports scattered like a battlefield. I thought you'd forgotten the way home, he said without looking up. Elena kept her voice calm. Rehearsals, new season opening. Always the rehearsals, always the dancing. He closed the folder sharply. And never the family. The silence that followed was heavy. The clock on the wall marked time like an impatient judge. Andrew took a deep breath before speaking again. I won't insist anymore, Elena. If you don't want to take what's rightfully yours, then I'll have to make sure the Moreau name lives on another way. She frowned, suspicious. What do you mean by that? I'm in negotiations with Charles Blackwood. The merger between our companies is underway. The name struck her like a blow. Charles Blackwood, her godfather, the man who had practically watched her grow up. And where there was Charles, there was also Michael. Elena lifted her gaze, trying to hide the impact. So that's it. You're going to hand over the family legacy to the Blackwoods. Not to them. To whoever is willing to protect it. Her father's voice was firm, almost solemn. If you don't want that role, someone will have to take it. Michael is the natural successor. Young, competent, relentless. Relentless, she repeated softly. Yes, he always was. Andrew watched her in silence, trying to decipher what lay behind her tone. But Elena looked away. The past had returned, more real than ever. That night, as the car carried her back to her apartment, she couldn't stop the storm of memories. Childhood in Brighton, summers shared between the families, fights over everything and nothing. Michael had always been her opposite, rational, competitive, incapable of losing. She remembered the day she called him arrogant, and he replied that she only hated in him what she couldn't accept in herself. She had been 15, and that phrase had hurt her more than any argument. Now he was the man who controlled the Blackwood empire, the man her father had chosen to ensure the Moreau future. And fate, in its usual irony, had brought them into the same orbit once again. When she got home, her phone vibrated with a notification. Presentation meeting. Blackwood X Royal Ballet Project. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Main conference room, Blackwood Group. Elena stared at the screen for long seconds. Her heart began to race in a way it hadn't since she was a girl. London seemed to breathe with her, in a dense, almost palpable rhythm. The city knew what was about to happen, and somehow, it seemed to be preparing the stage. Because some stories, no matter how much they try to be silenced, always return to the same point where they began. And hers was about to begin again. The next morning, the London sky looked like it was made of liquid silver. The clouds drifted slowly over the rooftops, and a thin wind slid through the streets of Westminster, carrying the damp scent of the Thames. The Blackwood Group building rose like a black mirror among the historic facades, modern, imposing, cold, exactly like the man who commanded it. Elena crossed the main lobby with restrained steps, her body still recovering from the hours of rehearsal the night before. She wore a beige overcoat, her hair tied with surgical precision, as if wearing an invisible armor. The click of her heels echoed on the marble floor, each step resonating among mirrored glass and the muffled voices of hurried executives. The name Michael Blackwood gleamed on the metal plaque at the top floor. And as the elevator ascended, she realized her heart was beating faster, not out of fear, but out of the discomfort of revisiting an old emotion, a mix of wounded pride and involuntary curiosity. The doors opened with a soft sound. The office was wide, minimalist, decorated in shades of grey and steel blue. A black piano occupied the corner, like a reminder that art also existed there, though suffocated by spreadsheets and contracts. Behind a glass wall, he stood, tall, in a flawless suit, the same steady and unbreakable gaze as always. Michael Blackwood. Time had sculpted him with precision. His face now bore sharper features, his slightly tousled hair contrasting with the evident control in every gesture. He spoke on the phone, his voice low, authoritative, laden with confidence. When he hung up, he didn't turn immediately. He seemed to savor the moment of keeping her waiting, as if he even controlled time itself. Elena stood tall, motionless, not allowing the memory of childhood, or of all their fights, to interfere with her posture. He turned slowly. His gaze traced her body calmly and precisely, as if studying a work of art he had known for a long time, but whose frame had changed. "Elena Moreau," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice echoed like something from the past. The Royal Ballet chose well. The tone was neutral, but his eyes betrayed something beyond formality. She kept her composure, crossing her arms. "I came at the council's invitation. I didn't know the project had your name on top." Michael walked to the window and rested his hands on the glass railing, looking down at the city. "Everything that happens in this building has my name on top. You should know that." The provocation was subtle, but intentional. He knew the effect it caused. She took a deep breath. "I'm here for work, Michael. Don't mix things up." He turned, approaching slowly, each step measured, each movement filled with control. "Don't worry. I don't mix business with memories." His gaze rested on her face. "By the way, how long has it been?" "Long enough that it doesn't matter anymore." The answer came firm, but the slight tremor in her hands betrayed her. Michael smiled faintly, like someone who understands more than the other wishes to reveal. "We'll see." For a few seconds, silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant hum of the city. The tension seemed like a string about to snap, or to vibrate in harmony. He broke the silence first. "The campaign will be big. Blackwood will sponsor the entire Royal Ballet season, and you, Elena, will be the central figure." She raised her chin, feeling the weight of irony. "And you're the one directing everything? It's my money. It's my name." He stepped closer, his warm, woody scent filling the air. "It's only natural that I'd want to control every detail." Elena gave a short, restrained laugh. "You've always needed to control everything, even what you couldn't. And you've always made sure to challenge me," he replied calmly. "Some habits never change." For an instant their eyes locked, and stayed. Neither looked away. There was anger, yes, but something else too. A silent magnetism, an old memory of something that had never been fulfilled. Michael stepped back, his tone returning to professional. "The presentation dinner will be tomorrow night. The Royal Ballet Council, our investors, the press. I want you there." "I want you there?" She arched an eyebrow. "Still giving orders as if the world revolves around you?" He leaned slightly forward, his face close enough for her to feel the warmth of his breath. "Maybe the world doesn't revolve around me, Elena, but it's funny. You still seem to orbit nearby." She blinked slowly, controlling the urge to respond in kind. Self-control was what dance had taught her, the same control she now used to hide the storm inside. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. "I'll be there," she said without looking back. "But only because the Royal Ballet asked. Not for you." The sound of the door closing echoed through the office. Michael remained still, staring at the empty space she had left behind, her delicate perfume still hanging in the air. He knew that encounter wouldn't be the last, and no matter how much he tried to deny it, something inside him had already shifted. The next day, London seemed dressed for a gala. The streets reflected the city lights, and the shop windows on Bond Street shimmered with the glow of jewels and gowns. The dinner would take place in one of the halls of the Claridge's Hotel, in the heart of Mayfair, the kind of place where luxury blurs into tradition. Elena arrived alone, wrapped in a black silk dress that left her shoulders bare and fell softly to her ankles. Her hair was up, her gaze steady, every step calculated. When she entered, heads turned. Not only because she was a ballet star, but because of the aura she carried, an elegance born of body and silence. From across the room, Michael watched. His father, Charles, and the company's board stood beside him. He greeted investors, exchanged polite words, but his eyes kept returning to the same point. Elena Moreau. She noticed, pretended not to. Served herself a glass of champagne, and walked toward the royal ballet guests, maintaining a diplomatic smile. But inside, she could feel his gaze pierce through her. It was like being on stage, knowing the audience is watching, yet trying to ignore the one presence that truly matters. The welcoming speech began. Michael stepped onto the small stage and, amid polite applause, spoke about culture, art, and business. His voice was steady, his tone confident, his posture flawless. "Ballet is the art of control and surrender," he said, looking directly at her, though the audience believed it was a generic phrase. "It's the ability to master the body to reveal the soul. And that is what inspires us to invest in projects like this." Elena felt her stomach twist. He knew how to use words. He always had. And somehow, that line seemed meant only for her. When the dinner ended and the guests began to disperse, she tried to leave quietly. But Michael was faster. His voice came from behind her, low, almost a whisper. "Still dancing with anger, Elena?" She stopped, didn't turn. "Anger is a powerful energy. It can move mountains, or destroy everything. Then be careful not to destroy yourself trying to prove something to me." The tone wasn't threatening. It was challenging. And challenge had always been the language they both understood. She finally turned. Their eyes met again, and in that instant, the entire room seemed to vanish. Michael took a step forward. She held her ground, but the air between them seemed to vibrate. "Time hasn't changed anything," he said softly. "Not even the way you look at me." She took a deep breath, fighting the impulse to answer. "Time changes everything, Michael, even what we think we feel." "Then why do you still tremble when you hear me?" No answer came. She looked away and walked off, her heart out of rhythm. He stood still, watching her disappear among the guests. He knew the night was only beginning, and that this encounter had rekindled something neither of them would have the control to extinguish. Outside, the night in Mayfair breathed luxury and silence. Cars slid in a neat line along the sidewalk of Claridge's, and the distant sound of a siren mingled with the murmur of voices leaving the hall. London was awake, but Elena felt herself in another time, as if walking inside a memory. The dress brushed softly against her body with every step, and the cold wind touched her bare skin, reminding her that real life was there, pulsing, indifferent to the storm inside her. Behind her, the familiar sound of steady footsteps. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. "Do you usually run away from every place where you're not in control?" Michael's voice came low, almost as a challenge. She stopped, without looking at him. "And do you usually chase every woman who dares to say no? Only the ones who pretend that no means something else?" The silence between them was like electricity. Elena turned slowly, her gaze direct, without disguise. "You're mistaken if you think you can still read me, Michael. I've grown up. Not that much." He took a step forward. "You still have the same look of someone who wants to run, but stays just to prove she's strong." She laughed, but the sound was restrained, almost sad. "Maybe because running from you was never easy." For a moment, they both stood still, only the wind passing between them, the distant sound of the city filling the emptiness. There was something dangerous in that silence, something that threatened to break the self-control they had both learned to cultivate. Michael raised a hand, as if to touch her face, but stopped a few centimeters away. "You haven't changed, Elena. And you still believe you can have everything." He smiled, a brief and tired smile. "Not everything. Only what truly matters." She stepped back, her body tense. "And what exactly truly matters?" "The things that neither money nor power can buy." His gaze held hers steady, and in that instant Elena saw what he did not say, that behind the arrogance there was still the same boy who used to provoke her just to keep her close, the same eyes that mixed pride and vulnerability. But before she could answer, the driver pulled the car up in front of them. "Good night, Michael." Her voice came out cold, almost rehearsed. He stepped close enough for her to feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. "Good night, Ballerina." The words came out like a whisper, more a touch than a farewell. Elena got into the car without looking back. But as the vehicle pulled away, his reflection on the glass seemed to remain. The dark suit, the unreadable eyes, the man she had never truly known how to hate. On the way back home, the city stretched before her like a musical score. Each light, each street, each memory marking a rhythm she could not ignore. Her heart beat out of sync, as if still dancing to the invisible sound of an old melody. Hours later, alone in her apartment, she took off her shoes and let the dress slide to the floor. She walked to the mirror and looked at herself. The body of a woman, the posture of a dancer, and the eyes of someone who, despite all her discipline, was on the verge of losing balance. She ran her hands along her arms, as if trying to erase the imaginary touch he had left in the air. But it was useless. Michael's touch wasn't physical. It was memory. It was provocation. It was the kind of presence that refuses to leave. The next morning, the sound of the piano filled the studio. Elena had returned to rehearsals too soon, perhaps to punish her own body for what her mind kept reliving. Each movement was sharper, each turn more intense. The other dancers watched in silence, fascinated by the precision, and by the restrained fury that drove her. The conductor stopped the rehearsal, praising her dedication, but Elena barely heard him. Her mind was far away, lost between the cold of the streets and the heat of a voice that still echoed inside her. After rehearsal, she sat alone in the corner of the room, her hair loose, her body covered in sweat, her eyes fixed on the mirror. The reflection showed a strong woman, but the gaze revealed a fragility she allowed no one else to see. Her phone vibrated beside her, a short, direct message. "I didn't finish the conversation. Dinner tomorrow, at 8 M." She took a deep breath, her whole body reacting to 2 letters. For a moment she thought of ignoring it, deleting it, pretending nothing had happened. But her heart, stubborn as always, had already answered before reason could interfere. The next night, fine rain fell over the rooftops of Notting Hill. The lights reflected in the puddles, and the sound of the city seemed slower, as if London itself were watching what was about to happen. The chosen restaurant was discreet, with wide windows and soft lighting. Michael was already there, waiting, dressed in a dark suit and with a gaze too calm for someone who lived among storms. When she entered, time seemed to adjust to the rhythm of the encounter. He stood, pulled out her chair, a simple gesture that felt out of place, as if it didn't belong to his world of power and business. "I thought you wouldn't come," he said when she sat down. "So did I," she replied without smiling. The waiter brought wine, and for a few minutes, silence reigned. The sound of rain against the window was the only thing filling the space between them. "Why did you call me?" she finally asked. "Because what was left yesterday can't end like that." "And what exactly was left, Michael?" "What always was left," he said, looking straight at her. "Everything we never said." She looked away, pretending to read the menu. "The past is where it belongs. Not when it insists on coming back every time I look at you." His tone was calm, but carried something dangerous, almost a confession. Elena's body reacted before her mind did. Her breath faltered for a second, and the wine burned stronger in her throat. "You still believe you can say whatever you want and the world will obey?" She tried to provoke, but her voice came out softer, more vulnerable than she intended. Michael leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "I don't want the world to obey, Elena. I just want you to stop pretending you don't feel." The words hung in the air. The clock on the wall kept time, but inside, time seemed still. She took a deep breath. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her tone a mix of defiance and surrender. He leaned slightly forward. I want you to stop dancing to escape and start dancing to feel." She didn't answer. She just looked at him for long seconds, as if searching in him for the reason she shouldn't fall. But his eyes were a familiar abyss, the same that had drawn her in when they were almost children. The rain grew heavier outside. The sound of drops hitting the glass echoed like a racing heartbeat. Michael reached out across the table but didn't touch her. He left his hand there, waiting, as if knowing the gesture meant more than the touch itself. She hesitated, and when she finally raised her hand to meet his, the waiter appeared beside them, breaking the moment. Both withdrew, and the moment dissolved, but was not lost. They ate little, spoke even less. And when they left the restaurant, the air felt lighter, but the look between them, that silent, dense look, still burned. Outside, beneath the glowing awning, he stepped closer, close enough for his voice to sound like a promise. "This isn't over, Elena." She smiled, with a mix of irony and surrender. Maybe it never began. Michael watched her get into the car and disappear into the rain. The cold wind blew, and he closed his eyes for a second, feeling her perfume still lingering in the air, the same scent from long ago when everything was simple and impossible at once. He knew the game had started again, and that this time neither of them would come out unscathed. In the days that followed, time in London seemed to move to their rhythm. The sky changed moods as quickly as the emotions suspended between control and desire. Meetings between the Blackwood group and the Royal Ballet became more frequent, and inevitably, Elena and Michael began to see each other almost every day. She tried to keep her emotional distance, taking refuge in rehearsals, as if the stage were the only place where she still had command over her body and her mind. There, under the cold studio lights, she felt she could breathe without fear, could hide behind the music. But even there, his presence seemed to exist. Sometimes, at the end of a spin, she imagined Michael's gaze watching every movement. It was as if he were always nearby, even when he wasn't. Michael, for his part, watched everything from afar. He had developed the habit of showing up unannounced at photo sessions or press interviews for the new season. He claimed he was only overseeing the investment, but everyone knew there was something more. The way he looked at Elena betrayed an attention that went far beyond professionalism. It was a silent gaze, steady, full of memories and of questions that had never been answered. One overcast afternoon, the main rehearsal of the season was held at the theater where the premiere would take place. The place was empty, except for a few technicians, the conductor, and Michael, seated discreetly in the back rows. Elena stepped onto the stage, focused, body ready, gaze fixed on the imagined mirror ahead. The music began, and she moved with almost painful precision, each gesture a dive, each step a secret, confessed only to the air. Michael watched her in silence, mesmerized by the way she seemed to command time itself. When the music stopped, the theater plunged into absolute stillness. Elena stood motionless for a few seconds, her chest rising and falling, eyes closed. Then she heard his voice fill the empty space. It was calm, but heavy with meaning. He said he had never seen something so controlled and yet so close to breaking. Said she danced like someone trying to convince her body she doesn't feel. The words floated in the air, slow and weighty, and she stayed silent. She didn't reply. She simply left the stage, her steps steady, her heart beating too fast to ignore. That night, fate brought them close again. An unexpected storm fell over London, cancelling appointments, emptying the streets, wrapping the city in a shroud of mist and light. Elena had left the theater too late, and the car meant to pick her up hadn't arrived. The rain grew heavier, cold and relentless, when the familiar sound of an expensive engine stopped in front of her. The window lowered, revealing his face, half lit by the headlights. Without a word, she got into the car. The silence between them was thick, almost tangible. The sound of rain against the glass seemed to fill the space that words could not. Michael drove calmly, eyes on the road, while her perfume filled the air, mingling with the scent of rain and leather. When the car stopped in front of her building, Elena didn't move right away. She sat there, watching the reflection of the wet city in the window. His voice broke the silence, low and rough. He said she seemed tired of fighting what she felt, and that control, as beautiful as it was, wouldn't protect her forever. She turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze. Said she didn't need protection, that the stage had taught her to endure pain with elegance. He replied that the stage could teach endurance, but never how to live. Time seemed suspended in that instant. Her breathing was light, her heart racing. He raised his hand, slowly, brushing a loose strand of hair that had fallen over her shoulder. The gesture was simple, but the silence that followed was heavy enough to break any barrier. Elena took a deep breath, opened the door, and got out without a word. She entered the building with quick steps, but as the elevator rose, she knew something inside her had given way. The hours that followed were sleepless. The city slept, but her thoughts did not. The memory of his gaze, his words, the light touch, everything felt too vivid to ignore. She walked to the window, watching the distant lights reflected on the rain, and wondered why she still fought against the inevitable. The next morning, routine continued, but something had changed. The meetings grew more intense, the encounters longer, the looks more lingering. It was as if every word exchanged carried a second meaning, an echo of what neither dared to say aloud. On a particularly cold afternoon, Elena was called to a photo shoot for the season's promotion. The setting was an old industrial warehouse, transformed into an artistic space filled with mirrors and soft lighting. She arrived before the team, silent, and found Michael talking to the photographer. When he saw her, his eyes lit up, though his face stayed composed, professional. The session began, and each click seemed to capture something invisible. A tension, a desire hidden between motion and gaze. The photographer asked Elena to dance, and she did, light, precise, spinning under the light that spread like liquid gold. Michael watched, motionless, until the photographer asked him to step closer, for a series of shots symbolizing the sponsorship. At that moment, the air seemed to change. She faced him, her body inches from his, eyes locked. The photographer gave instructions, but the words sounded distant. With each flash, the distance between them shrank, not in movement, but in intent. When the last shutter clicked, silence fell again, thick and heavy. Michael took a step back and thanked the team, ending the session. He said he was returning to the office, but before turning away, his gaze lingered on her too long. Elena felt her body respond to what his look said. That control was hanging by a thread, and the fall would be inevitable. That night, she tried to rehearse alone, as she always did when she needed to gather herself. The theater was empty, the piano playing softly, and the sound of her own steps echoed through the space. But something was different. The reflection in the mirror showed a woman who could no longer hide what she felt. Her body still danced with flawless technique, but her eyes betrayed the desire she tried to deny. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn to know. The mirror reflected his figure, still, watching. Michael crossed the stage in silence, approaching until he was only a few steps away. He said the empty theater seemed made for her, and that he had never seen her more real than in that moment. Elena kept her eyes on the mirror, without turning. She said she needed to dance to remember who she was. Michael replied that maybe that was the problem, that she only knew who she was when she danced, and never when she felt. The music continued, slow, enveloping. He stepped closer, and the reflection showed them side by side. The air between them seemed alive, as if the theater itself were breathing with them. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, she found his gaze in the mirror. Neither of them moved, but in that instant, without words, without gestures, something broke. The wall of control, the carefully built distance. The reflection showed the inevitable. Two bodies separated by inches, and a desire that could no longer be contained. Time seemed to stop, suspended between music and silence. The sound of the piano blended with the rhythm of their breathing, and the air around them grew dense, filled with a tension that asked for no permission, only to exist. Elena stayed still, but her heart beat out of rhythm, betraying everything her body tried to hide. Michael said nothing, only watched her, his gaze steady, calm, yet full of something he had long tried to conceal. When she finally turned, she did so slowly, as if afraid of her own movement. Their eyes met, and that was all it took for the rehearsal to become something else. No longer dance, but confession. Michael took a step forward, and the sound of his shoes on the floor echoed like a prelude. He said she seemed made of light and steel, and that he didn't understand how someone could be so fragile and so strong at the same time. Elena took a deep breath, trying to recover control. But control was exactly what was beginning to unravel. She said she needed him to leave, that she couldn't dance if she felt she was being watched that way. Michael replied that he wasn't just watching. He was trying to understand what she was hiding behind each gesture. He said her body spoke more than any words ever could. The music stopped, and the silence that followed was more intense than any sound. Elena took a step back, but Michael followed, as if the air between them were elastic. He said her art was both a wall and a bridge, and that he had always wanted to know what was on the other side. Elena tried to smile, but the smile didn't come. She said that on the other side there was only chaos, and that chaos didn't suit a man who needed to have everything under control. Michael reached out his hand, and this time she didn't move away. The touch was light, almost a breath, but it was enough to change the temperature of the air. Time dissolved, and for a few moments there was no stage, no rules, no story, only the now. He traced the outline of her jawline with his fingers, and Elena closed her eyes, as if the touch were both a threat and a relief. There was no hurry. His gesture was restrained, respectful, but full of intent. He said she had spent her life dancing above her feelings, and that maybe it was time to feel the ground. Elena opened her eyes, and the look she gave him was that of someone who understood perfectly what that meant. She said she wasn't sure she wanted to learn how to fall. Michael replied that sometimes it's the fall that teaches the body how to fly. The tension between them became almost physical, and for a moment the space seemed to disappear. The first kiss didn't come as an explosion, but as an inevitability. Slow, careful. The kind of touch born from a wait far too long. Elena felt the world spin, not around the music, but around him. It was like dancing without choreography, without a map, guided only by instinct. When the kiss ended, she stayed still, her eyes still closed, her body trembling slightly. Michael said nothing. He just looked at her, as if wanting to memorize every detail of that instant. Elena stepped back, just enough to catch her breath, and then gave a brief, sad smile, like someone who understands they've crossed a line. She said that shouldn't have happened. Michael replied that everything that happens when it's real happens because it must. She grabbed her bag, turned, and left the theater without looking back. Outside, the rain had started again, thin and constant, washing her face and erasing the traces of lipstick, but not what she felt. She walked to the car, her body light and heavy at once, as if every step were a surrender. In the days that followed, the world seemed to go on, but nothing was the same. The next rehearsal was different. Michael wasn't there, but his absence felt as present as his presence. Elena moved differently, freer, more human. Her body danced with something new, a kind of freedom born from vulnerability. The reviews began circulating even before the premiere. Newspapers praised the dancer's commitment, saying there was in her something intense, and new, as if technical perfection had finally met emotion. Elena read and pretended not to understand the reason. But deep down, she knew the reason had a name and dark eyes. Michael, on the other hand, tried to convince himself it had been a lapse. He spent his days in meetings and phone calls, avoiding the subject, pretending that routine could silence what his body still remembered. But every time he saw her, in photos, interviews, or articles, his control seemed to crumble a little more. On the eve of the premiere, a celebratory dinner was organized by the Royal Ballet Council. Elena arrived on time, discreet, and noticed him at the back of the room, surrounded by investors and familiar faces. When their eyes met, time stopped again. No gesture, no words. Only the silent understanding that what was between them was far from resolved. During dinner, they exchanged few words, but their looks said more than any conversation could. Michael praised her performance in rehearsals, and Elena thanked him, keeping a formal tone. But the way he said her name, slowly, in that deep, low voice, made her entire body react, even as her face remained composed. Later, as the room emptied, he approached her. He said there was something he needed to clarify before the premiere. Said he didn't want her to mistake what had happened between them for a mistake. Elena replied that the mistake wasn't tea in what happened, but in what shouldn't tea continue. Michael smiled faintly and said that control was just fear, disguised as virtue. Elena answered that fear was what kept people standing, and that maybe he should learn to fear something. His gaze stayed on her, steady, almost unguarded. He said that maybe he already did, and that the name of that fear was hers. Elena didn't reply. She simply turned her face away, but her whole body trembled inside. She knew that the next day, when she stepped onto the stage, nothing would be the same. The audience would see only the perfect ballerina, but within her would be a woman trying to dance with the weight of something that finally made her feel alive. That night, when she got home, she looked at herself in the mirror and noticed the shine in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The control that had always been her armor was beginning to turn into transparency, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. She knew something big was coming. Opening night arrived like a storm. London dressed itself in splendor. The streets around the Royal Opera House were filled with lights, cameras, and excited murmurs. Journalists fought for space on the grand staircase, while guests crossed the red carpet under the cold shimmer of flashes. Inside the theater, the air carried electricity, a mix of expectation and reverence. Backstage, Elena stood motionless before the mirror, her face partially lit by makeup and the yellowish reflection of the lamps. The white costume contrasted with the intensity of her eyes, where the serenity of a ballerina hid a storm no one could see. Every gesture was precise, every breath calculated, but inside she felt something new, the strange sensation of being too alive. The conductor warned that only minutes remained. Elena closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to focus on the music, but her mind refused to obey. Michael's image appeared among her thoughts, his gaze, his touch, the words left suspended between them. She tried to push it away, but the harder she tried, the more present he became, until her own body began to respond, pulsing to the same rhythm of desire and fear. Across the theater, Michael sat among guests and investors. He was impeccable, but his expression betrayed something different. It wasn't only pride, it was unease. He knew that night would mark a point of no return. When the lights went out and the orchestra began, his breath caught for an instant. The stage lit up, and Elena appeared. Not as a ballerina, but as something beyond technique. Each step was a fragment of soul. Each movement seemed born of a secret. The audience watched in absolute silence, as if they had forgotten to breathe. Michael, motionless in his seat, realized that her dance wasn't just art. It was a silent conversation between her and the world, and somehow with him as well. The music swelled and she spun with almost divine precision. But there was something human, vulnerable, in the way her arms opened, in the way her eyes searched for something not on stage. Her body spoke what her mouth dared not say. It was love. It was pain. It was surrender. When the final note echoed, the theater fell into silence for a second that felt eternal. Then came the applause. Thunderous, endless. Elena remained still, looking at the audience without truly seeing them. She searched for one face among the crowd. She found it. Michael was standing, applauding, his eyes fixed on her. His expression firm, yet stripped of any mask. Backstage, euphoria reigned. Flowers, embraces, flashes. But Elena heard none of it. She walked alone down the corridor, still in costume, toward the side door that opened to the street. The cold air wrapped around her. The distant sound of the city seemed far away, irrelevant. Michael appeared minutes later, as if guided by the same instinct. Neither spoke at first. The silence between them carried more weight than any words. She turned first, her face lowered. She said she no longer knew how to dance without feeling, and that it frightened her. He replied that feeling was what made her real. She lifted her gaze, eyes glistening, her body still trembling from the performance. She said she didn't know what to do with what existed between them, because everything felt too big, too intense, too dangerous. Michael stepped closer, slowly, close enough for the warmth of his body to mingle with the chill of the air. He said that maybe danger was the price of truth. Elena stepped back, but not far enough to break the distance. She said she couldn't lose herself again, that she had spent years building balance, and that one look from him was enough to destroy it all. Michael replied that balance wasn't the same as peace, and that sometimes life demanded disorder to be felt. She closed her eyes. Said that he spoke as if love were a matter of logic, but love had never been logical. Michael answered that maybe love was simply the most beautiful form of chaos. The wind blew strong, lifting the hem of her white costume, and for a moment she looked like a mirage, an image caught between dream and reality. Michael took the final step, the only one left, and wrapped her in silence. There were no words, no urgency. Only the calm gesture of someone who has found what they were unknowingly searching for. The kiss came like the last note of a song that had gone on too long. Slow, inevitable, complete. Time seemed to give way. The city around them became distant. When the kiss ended, she kept her face against his chest, eyes closed, body surrendered. She said softly that she didn't know what would come next, and that maybe nothing would make sense in the morning. He replied that meaning was right there, in the now, in the instant they finally stopped fighting what had always been. For a moment, they stayed like that, motionless, as if the world had stopped to watch. Then Elena stepped back, just enough to look into his eyes. She said the fear still existed, but for the first time, she didn't want to run from it. Michael smiled, that restrained smile that always carried something of arrogance and tenderness. He said fear, when shared, loses its strength. They walked together through the nearly empty streets of Covent Garden, the rain beginning to fall again, soft, cold, familiar. They said nothing more. The silence between them was a truce, not an ending. There was still much to be said, much to be discovered. But for now, it was enough that they were there, moving in the same rhythm. That night, Elena slept for the first time in months, without thinking of control. Her body, tired and free, gave in to rest. And when she woke, she realized that something inside her had changed forever. Michael, in his apartment, looked out from his penthouse window, watching the dawn rise over London. The sky was painted in gold, and he thought that maybe power wasn't what he had always believed it to be. Maybe true power was exactly that moment, the courage to feel at last. The game of desire had ceased to be a game. Now, it was something else. And deep down, they both knew that what had begun as provocation had turned into something neither of them was prepared to control. The dawn over London had the pale glow of a new beginning, but inside them, the silence was the same. What had happened between Elena and Michael lingered in the air like both a promise and a doubt. For a few days they let time breathe on its own, each submerged in their routines, trying to decipher what had been revealed and what still remained hidden. Elena returned to rehearsals, and although her body moved with the same precision, something had changed. The dance now came from a deeper, truer place. The technique was still there, but it was emotion that guided her movements. Others noticed. The conductor, her colleagues, the critics, all spoke of the new strength emerging from within her, unaware that this strength had a name and dark eyes. Michael, meanwhile, was divided between instinct and reason. The Blackwood companies were about to finalize the merger with the Moreau empire, and the weight of decisions grew heavier each day. Meetings, numbers, contracts, everything demanded the rigidity he knew so well. But his mind wandered constantly, returning to her face, to the touch still imprinted on his skin, to the gaze that disarmed him. For a time, fate kept them close only through circumstance. The events of the merger forced them to share the same spaces, the same meeting rooms, the same business dinners. But what had once been tension and desire now became something more complex, a mix of pride and vulnerability, love and fear, attraction and defense. One afternoon, during a meeting with the board, Elena entered the room without realizing Michael was already there. His eyes found her before she even lifted her gaze. He said he hadn't expected to see her there, and she replied she was only following her father's request. The tone was neutral, but the distance between their words was an abyss. The meeting dragged on for hours. At the end, the executives left one by one, and silence took hold. Michael remained seated, looking at the papers on the table, but what he saw was her reflection in the window glass. He said the whole world could agree with his plans, but a single look from her was enough to make him question everything. Elena stayed still for a moment, feeling the weight of his words. She said he had always known how to use vulnerability as a weapon, and that perhaps that was why she admired and feared him at the same time. Michael stood, slowly, and said that fear was the last refuge of those who feel too much. She turned to him, met his gaze, and said she couldn't live in a space where everything was a battle. Not on stage, not in life. Said that maybe their problem was this: they were used to fighting, not to staying. Michael took a step toward her but stopped before touching her. He said the fight had always been their most honest way of staying connected, because indifference had never existed between them. Said her presence disarmed him, that it both angered and freed him. Elena looked away, her chest rising and falling slowly. She said his freedom came at too high a cost, and she didn't want to be the price. Michael replied that maybe it was too late to go back, because what existed between them was no longer something that could be negotiated. The silence that followed was dense, and within it lay the truth neither dared to speak. She gathered her papers, thanked him for the meeting, and left. Outside, the cold wind cut through the streets of Westminster. She walked without direction, her body light and heavy at once. She knew that love, when real, brought no peace, but something inside her was beginning to ask for rest. In the days that followed, the news multiplied. The papers announced the success of the merger between the Moreau and Blackwood families. Investors celebrated, magazine covers showed smiling faces, but behind the headlines was a silence impossible to ignore. Elena realized her name was becoming increasingly tied to the business empire she had always rejected. Her father had fallen ill, and out of necessity, she began attending meetings, making decisions, taking his place. The life she had spent years avoiding now stood before her, and somehow she felt it was the right path. Not because she wanted power, but because it was time to prove to herself that she could exist beyond the stage, beyond Michael. The months that followed were full of change. Ballet gave way to travel and commitments. Her body adjusted to the stillness of meetings, but her soul still danced in silence. Sometimes at night, back at her apartment, she would play any music and dance alone. No technique, no audience, just to remember who she was. Michael watched from afar. He had learned of Elena's father's illness and sent formal messages, unanswered. He had tried to see her, but each attempt was met with polite refusal. And for the first time, the man who had always controlled everything felt powerless. The distance forced him to see what pride once blinded him to, that love is not conquered through control, but through surrender. One night, during a trip to Paris to sign contracts, Michael looked out his hotel window and saw the emptiness that success could not fill. He thought of her, her eyes, her voice, the way the world seemed clearer when she was near. The next day, he boarded a plane back to London, without warning. Elena was at home when he appeared. His face bore the exhaustion of someone who had stopped fighting the inevitable. He said he hadn't come to argue, or to persuade. He said he just needed to be there, before her, without masks. She listened in silence, said she had learned to live without him, but that life hadn't become any easier. Said that their love was too beautiful to fit inside fear, but too dangerous to exist inside pride. Michael stepped closer and said that maybe their love didn't need to fit into anything, only to exist. Said he had spent his life trying to control what he felt, and that now he only wanted to feel what was left. Elena looked at him, and in her eyes was the same light that appeared when she danced. She said love was a daily choice, and that if he was willing to stay, she would choose with him. Michael touched her face, and the gesture was the simplest and truest he had ever made. There were no promises, only presence. That night, it rained again in London, but the rain no longer felt cold. The whole city seemed to breathe in peace, as if recognizing that after so many falls, they had learned to dance together. Not to escape, but to exist. Love, at last, ceased to be war and became shelter. The morning sun broke over London with an unexpectedly gentle light. The rain from the night before had left the streets clean, and the rooftops gleamed like freshly polished silver. Elena woke before the alarm, her body still light, her mind at peace. For a moment, she simply lay there, watching the curtains sway with the breeze and listening to the distant sounds of the city waking. Everything looked the same, yet somehow the air felt different, calmer, more complete. Michael slept beside her, his face serene, the weight of responsibility momentarily gone. Elena watched him in silence and thought about how time had reshaped them both. The arrogance he once wore like armor had softened into quiet. Her resistance had turned into acceptance. Neither had won, but somehow both had found peace. She got up and walked to the window. The city pulsed outside, alive, imperfect, real. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman different from the one who used to dance just to prove something. Now, each movement was born from a place where love and fear coexisted, because she had learned that one could not exist without the other. When she turned back, she saw Michael waking. He looked at her silently for a few seconds, and then with his low, rough morning voice said there was something new about her. Something that didn't come from strength or technique, but from the serenity of someone who had finally stopped running. Elena smiled faintly and replied that maybe that was the hardest way to dance, to stay. The day moved quietly. They had breakfast together, unhurried, without plans. Words were few, but the silence between them no longer felt heavy. There was comfort in each other's presence, as if the chaos that once bound them had finally found its own rhythm. Without warning, Elena took him to the theater where everything had begun. The doors were open, the space empty, the stage still holding the echo of old applause. She walked to the center, took off her coat, and stood there barefoot, just like before. She said that every stage keeps the memory of those who dared to expose themselves, and that she wanted to leave there one last movement, not a farewell, but a beginning. Michael sat in the front row, silent. She began to dance, without music, without choreography, only the sound of her bare feet against the floor. Her body moved with both lightness and strength, a mix of technique and instinct. It was a different kind of dance. There was no control, no anger, only surrender. The natural light streaming through the gaps in the curtain painted her body in a mosaic of gold. Michael watched, and for the first time, understood what she had always tried to say without words. That dance was how she breathed the world. When Elena stopped, she walked toward him and asked what he had seen. Michael replied that he had seen the truth, simple, unadorned, and that he had never seen anything so beautiful. Elena smiled and said that truth is all that remains when fear finally falls silent. They sat side by side on the empty stage, and the silence that surrounded them was peaceful. She rested her head on his shoulder, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. She said that life wasn't about controlling what we feel, but about dancing with what we're given. Michael replied that if that was true, he wanted to dance beside her until the end. Elena lifted her gaze, and for the first time, she didn't feel the need to say anything. What existed between them no longer required words. It was something the world would only understand in motion, a gesture, a glance, the soft meeting of two hands at the right moment. The afternoon light streamed through the theater, gilding the wooden floor in their faces. The wind moved through the open windows, making the curtains dance on their own. The sound was soft, almost a song. Michael took her hand, and in that simple gesture lay everything they had been trying to say for years. Forgiveness, surrender, the promise of tomorrow. And there they stayed. Two still bodies, two souls in rhythm. Neither needed to prove anything anymore. Love at last was not war nor conquest, but the simplest and truest rhythm of all, the one born when two hearts decide to beat together. Outside, London breathed with them. The distant traffic, the sound of the Thames, the murmur of the city. Everything seemed to move to the same rhythm. The world went on, but inside that theater, time had stopped. Elena Moreau and Michael Blackwood, two names that had learned to face each other, now learned to coexist, like silence and music, body and soul, love and pride. The curtain, imaginary, fell. But their story was only beginning. What did you think of Elena and Michael's story? Leave your opinion in the comments. Rate the story from 0 to 10. What's your score? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories, and feel free to watch more touching. See you soon.